Oxford University hadn't seen silence like this in 800 years. The moment Professor Harrington said, "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization," a heavy silence filled the room. Ibrahim Traoré slowly stood up as over 500 scholars held their breath. What followed over the next 10 minutes not only went viral worldwide, it shattered Harrington's academic reputation. That March afternoon, the Sheldonian Theatre at Oxford was packed. The event was supposed to be a typical lecture on 21st century global leadership, featuring various international figures. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had been invited as part of Oxford's African Leadership series. He sat quietly in the front row in a simple dark suit, listening and taking notes while others spoke on development, democracy, and cooperation. At 3:30 p.m., Professor Edmund Harrington took the stage. In his late 60s, with silver hair and round glasses, he carried decades of prestige, author of 12 books, recipient of multiple honorary doctorates, and a renowned scholar on European history. His speech began confidently, even arrogantly. "When we look at the foundations of human progress," he declared, "we see mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, and industrial innovation from Britain." Then came the pause. He looked over his glasses and added, "The roots of civilization are clearly Western." Some in the crowd shifted in discomfort, but Harrington pressed on. 20 minutes into his talk, he made the statement that would define him forever. Some might mention Asia, gunpowder, paper, or the Americas with their calendars, but Africa? He paused again, this time with a smug smile. "I challenge anyone here to name one significant contribution from sub-Saharan Africa to human civilization. That continent has received civilization, it hasn't created it." The silence that followed was thick. Ibrahim Traoré gently closed his notebook and placed his pen on the desk. Round him, African students and scholars looked stunned, angry, yet hesitant in the face of such arrogance in one of the most prestigious halls of academia. Then Traoré raised his hand. "Yes," Harrington responded, visibly annoyed. Traoré stood slowly and said clearly, "Professor Harrington, I'd like to respond to your statement if I may." With a dismissive smile, Harrington gestured to the stage. "By all means, Mr." Pretending not to know who he was, though introductions had already been made. "Traoré, Ibrahim Traoré," he replied simply, "and I accept your challenge." A wave of interest rippled through the hall. Phones quietly came out to record what was about to happen. Harrington leaned back, smirking. "Please enlighten us. Just keep it historical, not emotional." Traoré walked to the podium calmly, carrying a simple leather folder. He paused, looking out across the audience, then directly at Harrington. "Before I begin," he said, "have you ever visited the manuscript libraries of Timbuktu? Studied the mathematical works of the Dafuna people? Or the metallurgical innovations of the Haya of Tanzania?" Harrington waved dismissively. "Ancient huts and tribal tales don't count as civilization, Mr. Traoré. We're talking about human advancement, not folklore." Gasps echoed through the hall, but Traoré didn't flinch. He opened his folder and held up a document. "Then let's begin with something you might recognize," he said. "This is a page from the Lebombo bone, found in Swaziland. It's 44,000 years old and it contains the oldest known mathematical markings in human history. 29 notches tracking lunar cycles. So no, mathematics didn't begin in Greece. It began in Africa." Harrington's smirk faded, but he tried to recover. "Counting notches isn't exactly Pythagoras," he scoffed. Traoré lifted another document. "Then let's look at the Ishango bone from the Congo, 20,000 years old. It shows knowledge of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. That's 19,000 years before Greek math." He paused to let the facts sink in. "But if you want more recent examples, fine." He looked directly at Harrington. "Let's talk about the University of Sankar in Timbuktu, housing 700,000 manuscripts, teaching 25,000 students, while Oxford was still a collection of taverns." The audience sat frozen. "You mentioned law from Rome," Traoré continued. "Let's talk about the Ashanti constitution built with checks and balances centuries before America's, or the Baganda parliament functioning democracy while Europe was still under monarchs." "You mentioned monarchs," Traoré continued, now completely in control of the room. And you spoke of philosophy from Germany. But have you ever read the writings of Zara Jacob? He paused, scanning the audience. He was a 17th century Ethiopian philosopher who explored ideas like rational thought and human rights long before the European Enlightenment. His student, Valda Haywat, wrote deeply on ethics works that rival anything produced in Europe during the same era. But I suppose, since they wrote in Ge'ez and not Latin, they don't count in your version of history. Harrington tried to interrupt. These are isolated cases, he began, but Traoré raised his hand unsurprisingly. The professor stopped talking. Isolated, Traoré said, his voice calm but firm. Let me explain what isolation really means. It's when the Library of Alexandria, built by an African dynasty, held the world's knowledge while the ancestors of Oxford's founders still lived in mud huts. It's when African mathematicians were calculating the Earth's circumference, while Europeans still believed it was flat. His voice rose slightly now, not in anger, but in conviction. You want contributions to civilization? Let's talk medicine. The first successful cataract surgery happened in Mali in the 14th century. The first C-section where both mother and child survived, Uganda 1879. And that was using antiseptic techniques that wouldn't reach European hospitals for another 50 years. He pulled out another paper from his folder. Vaccination? Not Jenner's cowpox. Africans practiced variolation against smallpox long before. In fact, it was brought to America by enslaved Africans. He held up another sheet. Architecture. The Great Zimbabwe's acoustic design still stuns modern engineers. The Nubian pyramids older than Egypt's. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from single pieces of volcanic stone with a precision engineers today struggle to explain. He paused again, but maybe you've never heard of any of this, because it doesn't fit your tidy little narrative of African primitiveness. The energy in the hall had completely shifted. Students who were slouching earlier were now leaning forward, scribbling notes. Several professors, once indifferent, now looked troubled, some nodding in agreement. Others clearly hearing this information for the very first time. Harrington, once smug, now looked pale and anxious. But Traoré wasn't done. Let's talk metallurgy, he continued. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing high-quality carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, long before Europe developed the technique. During the Industrial Revolution, and the Benin bronzes, so advanced that when Europeans saw them, they couldn't believe Africans had created them. So they made up stories about lost Portuguese craftsmen. He took another breath, then continued. Agriculture, Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. They built intricate irrigation systems in the Sao that supported cities with hundreds of thousands of people, while Europe was drowning in the Dark Ages. The terraced farming techniques of the Dogon people have kept communities thriving for over 1,000 years in conditions where European farming methods fail within a single season. He stopped briefly, locking eyes with Harrington, who now sat visibly sweating, despite the cool temperature in the theater. But perhaps most important of all, Professor, Traoré said, his tone now soft, but every word cutting deep. Let's talk about Ubuntu, the African philosophy that says, I am because we are. While European thinkers obsessed over individual rights and conquest, African philosophy developed ideas of collective responsibility, restorative justice, and human dignity concepts. The so-called civilized world is only just beginning to understand. The room was silent. The real tragedy, Professor Harrington, Traoré said slowly, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries ignoring, erasing, and actively denying those contributions. His voice, now quiet but devastating, echoed through the hall. When Timbuktu's libraries held more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When African astronomers charted the stars, you called us superstitious. When our doctors performed complex surgeries, you labeled them witch doctors. He pulled out one last paper. This is a letter, he said, written by Cecil Rhodes, the very man who founded the Rhodes Scholarship, which may have funded your education. In it, He clearly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonial domination. Colonization, Traoré said, his voice steady, your ignorance isn't an accident, Professor. It's the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase Africa's contributions to human civilization. And you've spent 47 years helping to keep that erasure alive. The theater was completely silent. Professor Harrington stood at the edge of the stage, mouth slightly open trying to respond, but no words came out. But Traoré wasn't finished. I could go on for hours, Professor, he said, calm but commanding. I could tell you about the Dogon people and their knowledge of Sirius B, long before Western telescopes could even detect it. I could explain the complex fractal geometry found in African art centuries before Mandelbrot gave it a name. I could show you how African call and response musical traditions became the backbone of jazz, blues, rock, nearly all modern music. But I think I've made my point. He paused, looked Harrington in the eye, and delivered the final blow. The real question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's top universities, don't know any of this. Or worse, he paused again. Why you do know it and choose to deny it. The silence cracked. A young African woman in the third row began clapping, then another. Within seconds, the hall erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood first. Then professors, even some university administrators joined in. But the most powerful moment came when Professor Mary Whitfield, head of Oxford's African Studies Department, stood and spoke into the microphone. Mr. President, she began, acknowledging Traoré's full title for the first time. As a representative of this institution, I offer you a sincere apology. Your words today have exposed a painful blind spot in our curriculum. I formally propose that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've presented today. The applause returned louder than before. On the side of the stage, Professor Harrington looked around for support. There was none. His decades of authority had vanished in just 10 minutes. As the noise died down, Traoré spoke again, this time, quietly. I'm not here for apologies, he said. I'm here for truth. And the truth is civilization does not belong to any one continent or any one race. It's the combined story of human achievement from the first mathematical markings on an African bone to the latest discoveries in space. He turned to Harrington one last time. As long as educators like you continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, we keep ignorance alive. Today, in this room, we have a choice: keep telling lies or embrace the full, rich, complex truth of human progress. Traoré gathered his papers and calmly returned to his seat. As he passed Harrington, he stopped for a brief moment and said just loud enough for the microphones to catch, Professor, I've left copies of all my sources with your department. I hope you'll take the time to read them. The impact was immediate. Within hours, videos of the speech exploded online. Titles like African President Destroys Racist Oxford Professor and the most epic academic takedown ever were trending across every major platform. By morning, the videos had millions of views. News outlets around the globe picked up the story. African universities came forward with even more examples to back Traoré's words. The hashtag Africa Built Civilization went viral. Professor Harrington released a brief statement the next day announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Oxford University followed with a formal apology and an announcement. It would launch a full review of its history curriculum. The Sheldonian Theatre, where it all happened, was chosen to host a new annual lecture series titled Africa and the Foundations of Civilization. The first speaker, Ibrahim Traoré. But perhaps the biggest shift happened among students. Enrollment in African studies programs skyrocketed across British universities. Young scholars began traveling to Africa, studying archives and ancient texts that had been ignored for centuries. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, the astronomical wisdom of the Dogon, and the surgical traditions of African healers all became serious academic subjects. A year later, Oxford unveiled a new statue in its main quadrangle. It wasn't of Ibrahim Traoré, he had declined the honor. It was of Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu. the 16th century scholar who authored over 1,600 books on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics while Oxford was still in its infancy. The inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, truth belongs to all humanity." In an interview years later, Traoré reflected on the moment. "I didn't go to Oxford planning to give that speech," he said. "But when I heard Professor Harrington's statement, I thought of all the African children who might hear such lies and believe them. I thought of the brilliant African minds who were erased or ignored, and I knew I couldn't stay silent." He paused. The real tragedy wasn't what one professor said. It's that his views were accepted for decades in a place that's supposed to represent truth and learning. How many students sat through his lectures, absorbing those lies? How many went on to make decisions based on them? When asked if his response was too harsh, Traoré shook his head. For centuries, Africa's story was written by those who enslaved and colonized us. They had no reason to recognize our greatness. When your history has been denied for that long, speaking the truth isn't harsh, it's necessary. Professor Harrington had 47 years to learn the truth. He chose ignorance. I simply chose not to let that ignorance go unchallenged today. What the world calls the Traoré moment is studied globally as a turning point in academic history. It's remembered not just as the day one man stood up to a lie, but as the beginning of a long overdue shift in how we talk about Africa, history, and human civilization. It proved that sometimes the strongest weapon against prejudice isn't outrage or violence, it's truth, told with calm dignity and undeniable evidence. And now, in classrooms from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, lessons on African history begin with a simple, unshakable fact: Africa didn't just contribute to civilization. Africa is where civilization began. The silence that fell on Oxford that day wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a truth the world could no longer ignore.